Psalm 62. Psalm 62. I was a youth pastor just outside of Washington, D.C. for a couple years. And when Becky and I lived down there, I got acquainted with Gallaudet University. Has anybody ever heard of Gallaudet University? And what is significant about Gallaudet University? Does anybody know? We've heard of it. Mrs. Stallard. Yes, it is. I believe it's the only accredited university in the United States, and it's designed specifically for those with hearing impairment and for the deaf. And I have a friend, his name is Doug, who is a soccer coach and referee, and he has a brother who is deaf, and he is fluent in sign and can teach sign, and so he's had a ministry with deaf people for a while. And so he would come down and bring his family, and he would participate in soccer camp there at Gallaudet. He'd bring students down from the Scranton State School for the Deaf, bring them down, and so his wife would stay with us, and then he'd go off to soccer camp for the week. Now, when we think of Washington, D.C., we often think of the mall area where all the monuments are and the museums, the Smithsonian's and all that, and about a 3-mile stretch of land, and that's nice, but outside of that, it's not so nice. And Gallaudet is right in the hood in Washington, D.C., and it's a really nice campus, but it's the kind of place you don't want to walk to at night. And if you drive there, do so quickly and make sure your doors are locked on your car. So my friend came down, and his wife was staying with us, and I drove him in to participate in the soccer camp. It began on a Sunday, and I had never been there, and I had never experienced anything like that, and I was really interested to see what it was all about. So we're in the car, we're driving through the streets of Washington, and we get to where we need to be, and we get the car parked, and he says, all right, we're all meeting in this building, and I'm going to go in and meet my kids and figure out where we're supposed to go, and the schedule, all the stuff that you need to know for soccer camp. So we pull in, and we start walking to the building, and we walked into the main door of this building, and we saw about 50 high school students in a room, and the walls that were all facing us were all glass, so we could see these 50 high school students in there, and there was a lot of activity that is going on behind those glass walls. There's a lot of movement. We could see a lot of communication happening. We could just see that by body language and, of course, by hand movements for sign. And had been in youth ministry long enough that I know what that sounds like. I know what that sounds like. And I thought, wow, that's a really well soundproofed room. The students are in there, and they're enjoying themselves, and they're all excited about soccer camp and what's going to happen. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to get to meet some of them and use the limited sign that I know, even to communicate with them in some way. So we walk in, and we open the door, and I was shocked by the silence. I should have thought of that going there, but my culture, my history, my experiences told me something different that I should expect to hear when I walked into a room of 50 teenagers who were all excited about soccer camp and all the things they're going to learn and being there with their friends and all the good stuff that goes along with that. I expected to hear a lot of noise, but when I opened the door and I walked into that room, there was still a lot of activity going on in there, but I was shocked by the silence in a good way. And that really changed my perspective in a lot of ways for that community and for that school. And it just was a neat thing to see them all communicating, yet doing so in silence. I want to remind you of one of the goals that we have for this series of spiritual disciplines as we are working through it. And this marks a halfway point today. As we finish today, we're halfway done. But one of my goals is that I have a hope that by going deeper, we will learn how the shallows of today's culture have conditioned us towards superficial living. And if this is something you haven't jotted down in your notes yet, I would encourage you to write this down so that you have it before you every week as we think about it. My hope is that by going deeper, we will learn how the shallows of today's culture have conditioned us towards superficial living. And the superficial living that we're really thinking about today, and the discipline that we're going to be talking about to combat that, is the fact that we are all expected to required to be noisy and busy all the time. That is the best way to deal with things. If we are struggling in our walk with Christ, if we're struggling with sin, if we're struggling with laziness, usually we can find at least one person, if not multiple people, who will give us the advice that the best way to deal with that is to stay, what's the word? Busy. Stay busy. Doing the King's business and being about his business is a good thing, but there has to be a time where we stop. There has to be a time where we stop and we have to take a break. We have to take a rest. And I think that for those of us who are steeped in North American culture, we need to learn the discipline of just settling down and being still. So the discipline we're going to look at today is the discipline of solitude. The discipline of solitude. And there are some words that we can use synonymously with solitude, because I really like to be around people. I'm not a hermit, but I'm also really good at being by myself. I can just do that. I can actually just sit and do nothing sometimes, and I'm actually kind of good at that. My wife gets after me and says, "Don't you want to go do something with people?" I can say, "Here, I'm good." That's not what we're talking about. We're not just telling you that you need to go be alone and sit there and do absolutely nothing. But I began to explain that there's some words that I want you to understand that are synonymous with this word solitude. It's not just aloneness, but it is a planned rest. And it is not simply being by yourself and looking into your own thoughts and being alone with your own thoughts, because for some of us, if not many or all of us, that is a dangerous place to be. If we exclude God from the solitude, if we exclude our relationship with Jesus in the solitude, if we ignore the prompting, leading, convicting of the Holy Spirit in our lives, that's not good biblical solitude. That's more akin with Eastern mysticism and meditating on something that has nothing to do with God, and that's not a good thing. But what we're talking about is a biblical view of solitude, getting away and not just alone by yourself, but because you have a relationship with Jesus, if indeed you do, we're asking you to find solitude in God. Now, I want to give you some examples from the New Testament. Here are a bunch of references, and you can jot a few of these down, and I'll leave it up there for as long as I can if you want to get as many of them as you can. But in the Gospels, Jesus demonstrates this discipline for us in solitude. And I was tempted just to preach a topical message today, and it would have been really easy using a bunch of these verses and just to have points like, well, Jesus demonstrated solitude in prayer. He did so by himself. Sometimes he would go away to pray, and I'm going to let you look these verses up on your own so that you can see where these things are coming from. That'd be a good devotional exercise for you, as we have talked about the discipline of study. You can employ that here. But we could have said, well, Jesus demonstrated being alone in prayer by himself. He did. He demonstrated taking his disciples alone to pray, just them, and getting away from the crowds that followed them and always wanted to see what Jesus was going to do next. They did that as well. In some of these verses that you will read, that Jesus sometimes got away by himself, sometimes took his disciples with him after a long period of intense ministry, and just had to say, all right, I need to get away from that, and I'm going to go away usually to pray, it says in these passages. And there's even a passage that talks about how Jesus went off to a solitary place after he had heard that John the Baptist was beheaded. So I think he went away by himself to mourn. And surely from the examples that we have about Christ in the Gospels, he did not just sit there and get all grumpy about the fact that John the Baptist was beheaded. It didn't make him happy, but I'm sure he was spending time with the Father in those times, by himself, away from the crowds, some solitude. So we could have done a simple topical message on that. I didn't want to do that. So I began looking and searching for a passage that would bring some of these ideas together, and I believe I found that in Psalm 62. And so that's where we are going to spend the majority of our time this morning. In fact, I don't believe we are turning to any other passages, so that's nice. You can settle in. You don't have to worry about a Bible drill today. I always like that when that happens. But in Psalm 62, we find the psalmist, in this case, it is David who's writing this psalm. And it is a theme that we see of his often, talking about his enemies pursuing him and some difficulties that he's facing, and how there are some decisions he has to make and where he is going to find his hope, his salvation, his strength from. So it is a theme of David's that we see often in the Psalms, and this is no different. Let me begin reading Psalm 62 at verse 1. Here's what he says. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Please let me read those two verses one more time. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Here's the first thing I want us to understand about this discipline of solitude this morning, and it is right up here on the screen. We need to discover stillness in the rescue of God. We need to discover stillness in the rescue of God. I want to show you literally what the opening line of this psalm says. It says, only to God is my soul silence. Only to God is my soul silence. And as I did some work in commentaries this week, there's disagreement over what exactly that means. And so the translation that we have in our Bibles, my soul finds rest in God alone, is them doing their best, and I can't come up with anything better. But I want to show you that what David is saying, he's speaking of this issue of silence. He's speaking of this issue of just being still and quiet. And it's very, very difficult to do that when we are surrounded by so many other things that are pressing upon us for our attention and our affection. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. Look at verse 2 and the words that he uses to describe this salvation that he is talking about. This rescue. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Let's talk about some of those words. Rock, fortress are really very close in what those words mean. And it means a high place of refuge. So when he says, you are my rock or my fortress, it is a place that he escapes to get away from the things that are attacking him, both physical things, spiritual things, emotional things, as people are conspiring against him. We'll see that here in a little bit. And then he says this, that he will not be shaken. And to not be shaken means to have divine blessing or security. So as we think about this issue of stillness, I want us to think about, again, discovering stillness in the rescue of God. Because each and every one of us would say that every day we wake up and we live in a world that puts a lot of pressure on us. You may live in a family that puts a lot of pressure on you. And you see all kinds of things from all different directions, from the media that we're exposed to, from our bosses at work, perhaps our teachers at school, or our siblings, our parents, our children. There are things that are going on, and they press us, and they sometimes rub our soul raw. It is a gritty world. And there has to be a place for those who have a relationship with God, for us who are the children of God, that we can go to and we can find the salvation. And David says here in Psalm 62 that he finds rest in God alone, who is his rescue, who is his rescuer. And he describes that the rescuer, you are my rock and my fortress, the high place that I can go to where my enemies can't get me. You are my protector. And he says that when he is there in his fortress of God, that he cannot be shaken. It is a place where he can enjoy divine blessing or security. Well, let me show you something here, the next few verses that are kind of an opposite to this. In Psalm 62, verses 3 and 4, let's look at those verses together. It says, wrong. I was in verse 63, chapter 63. No, we're in 62. Verse 3. How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him. From his lofty place they take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. How long will you assault this man? All you would throw him down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence. He describes man as a wall that is crumbling, and it is not all that sturdy, and it's not going to stand up very well, or a fence that's beginning to lean over. And he's talking about those who just want to push him over the edge, those who do not want to see him succeed. Verse 4, they fully intend to topple him. From his lofty place they take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. And he's talking about those who are saying one thing about him, but in their hearts they believe something totally different. And what he is showing us is that taking refuge in God does not banish the issues. Taking refuge in God does not mean that they go away. The psalmist David, in this case in Psalm 62 and elsewhere in the Psalms, never says, because I find my hope in you, God, because you are my rest, because in you alone I find my salvation, in you alone I find the place of rescue, because I found that everything else is just going to disappear. It doesn't say that. In fact, what David is describing for us is what we would call a biblical worldview. He understands that because God is his salvation and that he finds rest in God. One of the illustrations I read about this week is being in the eye of the hurricane, and everything around you is just blowing apart all over the place, but in the center there is rest, there's solitude, there's quiet. It does not mean that the hurricane outside has stopped. It just means that there's a place of rest and security in the center of all that. He's saying because that God is his rest and his security and the place where he can be and his refuge, that he can have a good view of all these things that are happening around him. The lies that are being told about him, the deceit that is going on all over the place. Do any of us ever have anybody who says one thing to our face and believes something else in their hearts? Conspires against us? Maybe you have even experienced that this past week. Or you just feel like you are on the edge and you are teetering and it won't take much to push you over. And there's all this stuff that is happening around you. Finding your rest in God alone does not mean that it goes away. It means that we can have the confidence, the divine blessing of being in refuge with God, having a soul not shaken. I spoke at a youth conference yesterday and Friday out in Western New York, and it was a real blessing to me to be there and to participate in ministry with some friends out there. And I got the schedule for the weekend, and they had everything laid out, how the main sessions were going to go, and the songs they were going to do, and all the preliminary stuff. And I don't know how many of you, the last time you've been to a youth conference like that, but they usually give away a lot of things, and they're saying, and this is like a rural farming community, they're like, all right, if you own chickens, run back here and we're going to give you a chocolate Easter bunny, and like all this kind of stuff that's going on. The kids are going nuts, and they're really liking that. So I'm reading that saying, yes, this is all part of the show that they have to do. And then it had a line, it had a girl's name, her name was Bree, and it said testimony. Now, usually when I know that kind of stuff is happening at a youth conference, I get a little anxious inside, because I never know what they're going to say. And they may mean well, but perhaps you've had this experience too at some point, that they mean well and they want to say something right and they want to say something true, but it doesn't turn out well. So I'm a little skeptical. So even though I know this girl a little bit, and I know her family, and I know her dad's a pastor, and they do a great job, I was still skeptical. I thought, oh no, and I'm going to have to follow that and clean up the mess, is what I'm thinking, because I'm a little cynical. This young lady got got up. She's just in high school. I believe she's a sophomore in high school. And she began telling a story about her cousin, Ashley, who is not all that much older than her. In fact, she's just 20 years old. And she told a story about how her cousin Ashley made some really poor choices when she was in high school. And just kind of walked away from her family. And so this other girl who's giving the testimony, her mom and dad really tried to be her parents and tried to shepherd her. And she began making some better choices. And God arrested her heart. And she gave her life to Jesus. And she started making some good choices based on what she knew God expected of her. And things were going well in her life. She joined the Marine Corps and loved it. In fact, she came home from boot camp and all her family, she's a little petite, tiny little thing. And her family said, "Did you do okay?" And she said, "It was the best time I have ever had." I don't know many people that say that about Marine Corps boot camp. I would be excited for about 3 days, but after that, I probably have enough. And she loved it. She just loved the whole experience. And so they had pictures of her. She's in her uniform, just ready to floss her teeth with barbed wire and take out a terrorist camp someplace. She's ready to go. She's locked away. And she met her now husband in the Marine Corps, a believer, a child of God who wants to live his life for God. And so they got married right before he got deployed to go to Japan. And soon after they got married and he got deployed to Japan for 2 years, she discovered that she's pregnant, 19 years old. She's married, she's pregnant, 19 years old, just fresh out of boot camp and her first assignment somewhere in down south. And in the course of her pregnancy, she had a significant pain in her lower back. And it got worse and worse and worse. And finally, the girl, Bree, who is giving the testimony, said that her parents took her to the emergency room. She got medical leave from the Marine Corps, and she went up to the Rochester area where they were, and they took her to the emergency room, and after a series of tests, they discovered that she was diagnosed with an osteocarcinoma. She has a tumor in her pelvic bone that is inoperable and ultimately cannot be cured. She is in agony. Her husband came home from Japan as fast as he could. And during the night, she could not sleep. She was in so much agony, and so he would rub her back, rub her feet, whatever was necessary for her to just be in some kind of comfort. She gave birth to a beautiful little girl. Her name is Lily. Premature, little tiny 4-pound baby. They showed pictures of this little precious baby. And this girl knows that she is going to die. Short of a miracle, which God can do. He can still heal her. However, he may choose to let her die. He may choose to let her die in pain. And so my skepticism is quickly eroding as I'm listening to Bree share her testimony, and my skepticism is being replaced by conviction, thinking I should just trust the people who put this thing together in the first place. And then that conviction began to speak to me as this girl continued to share truth about how her cousin, Ashley, her husband, her family, her dad, who's a pastor, all her sisters and her brother understand where their refuge and their salvation is. She does not want to die. And that is very appropriate. However, for Ashley Bridges, and I would ask that you pray for her. She's 20 years old now. She's facing death. She almost died a few weeks ago. She developed an infection in her stomach and had to have radical surgery, and their thought was she's either going to just die from the infection or she probably will die from the operation. She survived and is coming along, but she's in rough shape. But her own testimony, and the youth pastor got up afterward and read a text message she just sent her father before she went into surgery, saying, "I find rest in my salvation in God alone." I hope the doctors do a good job. I hope the surgeon's hand is steady. but my ultimate hope is not there. I find rest in the turmoil of suffering, even though I'm teetering on the edge of death. Talk about a fence that is weakened, a wall that is rapidly falling apart as this young lady's body, who should be in the prime of her life, she's falling apart. But because she understands not the strength of her own self, which is a Marine, pretty tough. Her strength is not found in that, but is found in the person and character of God alone. She understands, though she may be slain, the rest is still found in God. If God in his sovereignty decides to call upon me to suffer in that way, I hope in the name of Jesus that I remember that facing a situation and turmoil like that, I do not have to be shaken. And in the midst of suffering, I can still find rest. I know some in this room are suffering similar to Ashley. I pray in the name of Jesus you find rest in God alone. I pray for those who are not physically suffering, but you suffer emotionally. Your heart agonizes over your family, your spouse, your children, your job, the testimony that you're called to have in a world that is fraught with hurricanes, a howling wind and rain that blows sideways. You realize that taking refuge does not banish the issues, but gives you perspective. In verse 5, we read this: "Find rest, be still, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge." We see a lot of words in those verses that we read in the first two. He's repeating them for effect to help us to understand. But here's the second thing I want us to think about in regard to solitude. Discover stillness in the hope of God. Discover stillness in the hope of God. I asked you first to discover stillness in the rescue of God, having perspective of these situations. But next I'm asking that we find stillness in the hope of God. Find rest, stillness, quiet. O my soul, the center of my being, in God alone, for my hope comes from him. My hope does not come from the fact that I can just shut out the world and be alone by myself, and I can lock up everything and seal the windows and doors and all the drafts in my heart of all the cold, dark wind that can blow in and can make it raw and terrible. My hope does not come from what I can do, but it comes in what God can do. Alone. There's no list. Well, I guess there is a list, but there's one item on the list. It is a person. My hope comes from God alone. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. Words that we looked at before. I will not again be shaken. I have divine refuge and understanding and care there. My salvation and my honor depend on God. My rescue and who he is as a person does not depend on him as a person. It depends on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Look at verse 8. Trust in him at all times, O you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for our God is our refuge. I want to spend some time talking about what that means as we talk about discovering the stillness in the hope of God alone. And we come down to verse 8, and he says, trust in him at all times. A familiar theme that we find in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, one of those passages that we have in magnets on our refrigerator or little needle points on our wall. Trust in the Lord. How's it go? With all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Wow, that was really weak, but we'll take it. All right. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Two vastly different poles there. Are they not? Trust in the Lord. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways. Pretty inclusive. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. We see this same theme here. Trust in him at all times, O people. So in the beginning part of the psalm, David is reflecting personally. And he's saying, take refuge, O my soul, in the solitude and the stillness of God. Even though the winds are swirling about me, I take refuge in God, and they do not go away, but I have perspective. Now he's giving instruction to the reader. And he's telling the reader, all right, here's what you need to do and what we need to do. And I'm sure he's teaching himself as well. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him. For God is our refuge, our high place that we seek safety. Let's talk about this pouring out our hearts to him. That can mean a lot of different things. It's used in different ways in the Old Testament. It could mean pouring out some water in the desert, all of it from the cup, gone. It can mean pouring out the blood of a sacrificed animal, all of it poured out. It can mean all those things. So when David is saying, pour your hearts out to God, what do you think he is saying? We visited prayer not too long ago. It's one of our disciplines, and we talked about that. And we discussed some issues about prayer and why that's an important thing. And I think it makes logical sense that when we read about the psalmist telling us to pour our hearts out to God, that it makes the most sense that we would be doing that in prayer, right? We're going to talk to God, and we're going to tell him what is going on inside of our hearts. So if we're pouring our hearts out to God, what does that include? It's an easy answer. What does that include? Everything. Everything. It includes everything. So as we get together in our small groups that happen on Monday nights, and we encourage you to join those, both for men and women, here at 7 o'clock, we discuss what's going on in the morning worship service. We always have a time of prayer. And I know in our men's small group that I'm encouraging our men as we talk about the things that we need to discuss with God, that we need to take with God, that we need to be pouring out our hearts. And if we're really pouring out our hearts and we're doing so in community in those small groups, then I wonder why our list of prayer requests seem always to be limited to physical needs, which are important. But if we're really pouring out our hearts to God, why do we not spend more time talking about our spiritual needs and the brokenness and the places where we need restoration in our hearts, in our lives, in the center of our beings? If we are really finding rest in our souls and God alone, and we're trusting him at all times, are we going to pour our hearts out to him? So it's like we have a precious liquid in a cup, like in here. This is precious. It is black gold. Is it oil? Oh, no. It's something far better. It's coffee. So we have in our relationship with God, as the psalmist instructs us, he's not just saying, well, this is what I need to do. He's saying, this is what you need to do. And because this is divine revelation, we should be paying attention to this. He has this relationship, and he's talking about his relationship with God. He says that he, me, you, us, his readers, we need to trust God with all our hearts. And in doing so, we need to pour the whole thing out. How often do we even see that theme in the New Testament? Jesus says, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Give me the things that you carry. Cast all your cares upon him, because he's angry at you, because he's mad at you, because he's displeased with you. No, why are we told to do that? Because he cares for us. So finding rest in God alone and trusting him with all our hearts, it seems to be part of this. Says, now pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. And God says, yeah, give it to me. I can handle it. You know the universe you live in? I made that. What is happening in your life? I'm sovereign over that. The fact that you can call me father and I can call you son or daughter, I'm responsible for that. Because my son Jesus was obedient to me and gave himself to be murdered. So all that is for you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to find your rest in me. I want you to pour out all the contents of your heart and give them to me. So we say, okay, here you go. Is that good? There's some. I poured some out, God, but I'm going to hold the rest because I live in a world that tells me that I have to be in control. Yeah, but there's some things way beyond your control. Don't you realize that? Yeah, I know. I hear what you're saying, God. And I understand that there are some things I can't fix. If I get sick and I go to the doctor and I'm trying to take care of all the things medically I want to do, and I just don't seem to be getting better, I know that that's probably something that you want me to give to you. But I feel like I have some control in my life if I don't. So I'm just going to hang on to that. But I'll tell you what, I'll give you some of my relationships. So we give them a little bit more. God, who knows all things and knows the contents of our heart and what is there and what is not there, could ask the question, did you give me all of your relationships that are troubling you? Did you give me the relationship that you have with your sibling, who you are just anguishing over, who seems to be running from me, and you want her to find me, and you're concerned about that? Are you holding on to that? Yes, God, I actually am. Thank you very much for asking. I know you know everything. I might as well be honest with you, because frankly, I think I can hold on to that, and I can do something about that. I need to have control, and God says, no, give it to me. Trust me with everything you have. Pour out the contents of your heart. Yeah, but that would mean that I can't find refuge in anything that I do. Do you think? God, if I give you all the contents of my heart, every last drop I pour out, and it comes out, and I give it all to you, I have nothing left. Now what do I have control over? Well, nothing. That's what I'm for. Give it to me. My ability to absorb what is in your heart and all those who have a relationship with me is far greater than you could possibly understand. I love the fact how, studying this, I was taught that trusting God means something more than I say I agree with him. It means something more that I hold to the same doctrine that many of you do in this room. It doesn't mean that I can just say those things and have mental or even emotional assent to those things, but I am commanded, and we are told, and we are given example by David in this psalm to give him the contents of our heart. And it may not be a nice fragrant liquid like coffee. It could be vile and gross and smell bad. God says, I want that too. And then to and then we find here in verse 9, it says, low-born men are but a breath, the high-born are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. If you poor, you're rich, put you on a balance in this economy, in this system. What is that? It's nothing. Do not trust in extortion or take pride in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. So kind of the contrast here, we see that finding hope in God does not eliminate earthbound strategies. Finding hope in God does not eliminate earthbound strategies. We are still going to be tempted to hold on. And he gives us a couple illustrations of that, but between the rich and the poor, and hopefully there are no extortionists or outright thieves in this room. That would be bad. He says, do not trust in that kind of stuff. It is nothing. You can't do anything about that. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. Do not fill your heart and set your attention and affection on these things. Pour it out to God. And then lastly, number 3, discover stillness in the character of God. Discover stillness in the character of God. Verse 11. One thing God has spoken, 2 things I have heard. That you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving. Surely you will reward each person according to what he does. One thing he has spoken, two things I've heard. I think that's just beautiful in poetry. One thing he has spoken, two things I've heard. That you are strong, you are loving, and you reward those who follow after you. In the very beginning of the series, I told you that there are some phrases that need to be banished from our lives. If we expect to develop some spiritual disciplines and escape the shallows of life and move into a deep teaching, fellowship, and discipleship with Jesus Christ. And there are things that say, there are the phrases that say that we are the captains of our own destiny, that no one can tell us what to do, and all that nonsense that we hear in public high school graduations or on our TVs or we see on our banner ads on the internet every day. We are convinced, or we're tried to be convinced over and over, that the best way to ensure a full life, a happy life, a restored life is that we can restore ourselves, that humanity can restore itself in the midst of brokenness. We see that all the time. I don't know if I just thought of this, and if I shared this with you in the past 6 weeks, forgive me, but it just came to mind. When I watched President Obama give his speech at Sandy Hook after the tragedy that happened there, I felt bad for him because the fourth time in his first term he had to do that. He had to go to a place and try to comfort people who faced mass murder, and it's a terrible thing, and I felt bad for him, and I was praying for him as he gave his speech. I pray for our president, as should you. And he quoted a bunch of scripture, actually out of 2 Corinthians 4. He quoted a bunch of scripture, and he went on to talk about the wretchedness of a human heart and what it is capable of, how it is evidenced before us. And it has been said that you do not need to have faith to see the results of not having faith. Everyone can look around and see the wickedness in the world. So he did a good job at describing the evil that lurks within the hearts of every human being. But his solution was ill-founded, because he said that the solution can come out of the same source. And that if we just try hard enough, if we just love ourselves enough and each other more, that we can eliminate these problems. I'm sorry, my Bible does not say that. David in the Psalms never says, well, they're trying to kill me, I guess I'm just going to have to figure out a way to be happy about that. No, my soul finds rest in God alone. God is my silence. And sometimes in the silence we get slapped around. And that's a good thing. By focusing on God's character in the times of solitude, and we think about his character, particularly his strength and his love and all that those things entail. It reminds us about our own brokenness, our own human thinking that we can fix everything. And it tells us something true about God, that he is more loving than another person who might even want to help us, and he is stronger than the situations that are around us. Another young lady gave her testimony yesterday afternoon before I spoke, and I still was anxious about that. I thought, oh no, this one is not going to be very good. A young woman who grew up in the youth group of a friend of mine who was a youth pastor, and she told a story about how her senior year of high school, she completely abandoned her relationship with God, and she went out and made some very poor choices, and she was in and out of public mental health institutions, and it got to the point where she could not be trusted to be by herself because of what she thought she might do to herself or someone else, and she rejected all these things. And finally, she ended up going to a treatment facility, a Christian treatment facility for 17 months in Indiana, a place where they speak truth. And they concentrate on the character of God and the true place of rest for hurting souls. And she told a group of her peers of 400 students how she had a terrible attitude when she got out there and just complained about everything, the food, which, I don't know, probably wasn't all that good, and the treatment she was getting, and her roommate, and the counselors that she had. And she said finally she had this one woman who spoke truth into her life, who pulled her aside and finally said to her, "You have got to decide what you're going to be defined by. Your entire life you've defined yourself by yourself, and that is not a good measuring stick. It's inaccurate, and it's defeating. And for those who do not have a relationship with Christ, let me tell you something. If your measuring stick is yourself, it's not only inaccurate and defeating, it is also damning." So this woman spoke into her life and said, "You have got to understand that you are not the measuring stick of your life, but the character and the person of God is. So it is time that you acknowledge the truth that you claim that you have and allow God to start working in your life." She said it was at that moment she got slapped around in the stillness before God and understood that her orientation was completely off. She still struggles, but her refuge is not ever to be found in her own heart. It's in the person and character of God. So this week, as we are now halfway done with our series, I encourage you to look up some of those verses. If you didn't catch all that, you can send me a text or an email, and I'll gladly send those to you. The passages in the Gospels, and you can look at the example of Jesus, and you can look at the example of he and his solitude. And you can ask yourself a couple questions, such as, when it is time to be alone, who are you alone with? Because you never really are truly by yourself. But when it is time to be still in solitude, and we are not called to a life of solitude, we are not called to be a bunch of monks locked away in a monastery making our own beer and cheese, which I'm sure would be fantastic if we were making it. But we're not called to just do that and be hermits and live by ourselves. But we do see examples from especially the life of Jesus where there are times to do that. So who are you alone with? What do you do in those alone times? Do you sink further into your own despair and your own depths, or do you find your refuge in God alone, in your stillness in Him? God, thank you for this morning. I thank you for our time together. God, I pray that we would be a people who understand you have called us to do something. Called us to be on mission. You've called us to engage one another, to speak truth to one another, to minister to one another, to use the gifts for the edification of the body. But God, I pray that we also would just keep in mind that we are pressured from all sides just to be busy all the time, God. And it is a good thing to be still, quiet, and silent in your presence. God, I pray that if some of us need to get slapped around in that presence, we would, and we would respond to it. We love you. I pray these things in Jesus' name.